Hello, one and all, and welcome to the SuperShow podcast, episode number 199, Jonesy. That number just keeps on getting bigger. We keep ticking closer and closer to the big 200. I'm your host for this week, Jamie, and joining me as we break down a week that delivered gaming news courtesy of all three of the major console families is my friend and yours, and the designer-in-chief of one of my favorite pieces of abstract art of all time, aka the thumbnail of this very video. It's Mr. Alex Jones. Talk us through your creative process, sir. We need to know. What are your secrets?
Look, I don't want to give everything away. One part of being a creative is not telling people how the process works, because sometimes people think you're kind of crazy. But no, yeah, this was a collaboration between me and multiple AI image generation softwares, as I'm sure people can probably tell. But yeah, Phil spilled the beans, so we had to.
Do you know what? I was about to say it is what it says on the tin, which itself is another accidental bean joke. But Phil did indeed spill the beans, and you have represented that beautifully, courtesy of, as I liked how you put it, is your AI collaborators. I think that's something we have to get used to as artists coming forward and saying, no, I did make this. It was in collaboration with various pieces of artificial intelligence. I feel like you're breaking new ground already, Jonesy.
It's quite funny because what the big news of this week regarding AI and last week was OpenAI's Sora, and we started to see some of those videos pop up and people tweeting them out, and they were kind of everywhere. And obviously in our industry, a lot of people were saying, it's the end of people making videos. It's the end of having to worry. And I kind of had that feeling, but then after a while, I just thought, no, it isn't. Someone has to stitch all these different clips together. Like, if that was the case, Shutterstock would just be a replacement for our editors, and it isn't.
Right.
So no, we're fine, mate. We're going to be all right for a few years to come yet.
You know what? I'll take your word for it. And the other person whose word we have to take this week is Phil Spencer, and he believes that the people that are going to be around for a little while yet and fine for a little while yet are the fine folks over at Xbox. We're going to be talking about everything that they had to say in their business update podcast. It feels like a bit of an oxymoron, like it's a business, but hey, they did it, their wording, not ours. We're going to touch, as I hinted at earlier, also on some PlayStation news and some news about the future of Nintendo and their hardware plans. And all of this is available to you on a number of different platforms, at least one of which you are tuning into it on right now. It's on YouTube. It was, little peek behind the curtain here, at one point live on YouTube. And between me and Jonesy, we don't really know where the blame lies. I'd say blame loosely. No one's actually at fault. But we had enough internet problems that we decided to bring it offline this week, which is why you're seeing this as an upload rather than the VOD of what was once a live stream product. That means, Jonesy, we're going to miss out on your favourite part of the show, which is talking to the chat.
I know. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that this week, but at least we'll have a solid show where we won't have... Sorry, you started to say blame. You don't want to attribute blame. I would attribute blame to ISPs. Like, it's their fault. Whoever's fault it is, it's the ISP's fault. Come on, let's have some more... let's have some more serious internet that works no matter what.
Yep, fuck them. They're putting caps on the amount of data we can use. They're cutting off our speeds during peak usage times. Fuck them. They do everything wrong, and all we do is foot the bill. That's our platform now. We're just a fuck ISP podcast with a little bit of gaming on the side. But you know who doesn't have to go fuck themselves, Jonesy, for the time being at least?
Who's that?
Podcasting platforms, because they continue to host this fine podcast. I'm talking about platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts. If you haven't already, you can head over there and listen to the audio-only version of this very show. You could even leave it a review if you feel so inclined. I also have to give a shout-out to Paisley Radio, the people who keep the show beaming out through the radio waves, albeit digitally speaking, over at paisleyradio.com on Thursdays at 10 p.m. One of those weird things, as we joked before, where you can actually watch or listen to this podcast whenever you'd like, because it's available on demand on a number of different platforms. But if you want to feel like there is some risk of missing it, like you're rushing back from the kitchen with a cup of tea and or coffee, and you've missed the first minute of the show, then Paisley Radio apparently is the place to be. Jonesy, how about we dive right in and talk a little bit about Phil and his beans, seeing as you grace us with that thumbnail?
I'm so ready, man. I want to know all about Phil's beans.
Well, do you know what the funny thing about Phil's beans are? Is that actually I was looking back on our recent episodes, and a couple of weeks ago, one of our leading news stories was us sitting around and looking at Phil holding the tin, and we were guessing what the beans were. And I think it's fair to say that the guesses at the nature of those beans and where and when they might be spilled led to a bit of a furore online. Namely, we were talking about the potential for Xbox to go multi-platform in a pretty big way in the future. We were speculating about titles such as future hits, Indiana Jones potentially, recent hits like Starfield, iconic franchises like Halo, all potentially hitting other consoles, in this case, probably the PlayStation 5 or the Nintendo Switch or other future consoles that those manufacturers may release. And that led to speculation that the whole thing was unraveling. Xbox influencers were retiring. People were throwing their Xboxes in the bin. There was a lot of noise and a lot of uncertainty, and that has all been addressed largely thanks to this business update podcast that I mentioned earlier, where Phil Spencer was joined by, I think it was Sarah Bond and Matt Booty, who... Matt Booty is still one of my favorite names in the industry. The one that's close is, there's a guy at Bethesda, I don't know if you remember this from E3's gone by, he does a lot of the Elder Scrolls Online stuff. He's called Matt Firor. I think it's like Firor. But the first time I heard him say it, I thought he was called Matt Thyroid. So I just kept calling him Matt Thyroid. And I don't know, that's one of my favorite E3 memories, is just saying Matt Thyroid whenever that guy came on stage. Did you get a chance to catch... Sorry, go for it.
No, I was going to say, for me, the best has got to be Bowser. That's ridiculous.
You're right. How could we forget Doug Bowser?
Yeah, you can't work anyone else. You can't work anywhere else except for Nintendo with a name like that, can you? That's
no.
It's like being called Baker and working for a baker's. That's amazing.
Exactly. Like, Doug Bowser is so befitting of that company and that role that I'm sure there was actively at some point a conversation about whether they couldn't give him such a public-facing role because of his name, because it would seem like a joke. Like, to have a name so good it actually almost costs you a role because of how perfect it is. That's when you know you're in the kind of territory that Matt Thyroid can only dream of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're born to do that role.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to ask what role Matt Booty was born to do, but it wasn't up for one of the topics up for discussion on the business update. I was going to ask, did you get a chance to catch any of this, or have you been scouring headlines?
No, I was purely scouring headlines with regard to this one. I didn't actually watch the update. I will probably end up watching it after this podcast or recording at some point. But because we'd already covered it, obviously we knew the sort of things we were going to hear. But there was some good updates, some good sort of insights, and some confirmations in the headlines for at least for this little business catch up.
Yes, absolutely. Starting with what I think was top of most people's list in terms of what they wanted Phil to talk about, which was addressing those cross-platform or multi-platform plans. And Microsoft have now confirmed that 4 as yet unnamed Xbox exclusives will be released on other console platforms, presumably the PlayStation 5 and the Nintendo Switch. Now, Phil, for whatever reason, didn't talk about which games these were specifically, but he did talk around those games, pointing out that 2 of them were kind of community-driven, potentially multiplayer projects that made sense to get on other platforms, in the same way that Minecraft and Destiny 2 are also on quote-unquote rival platforms already, and the other 2 were slightly smaller scale, single-player projects, perhaps not even projects designed to be the start of a new franchise, things that Xbox didn't even necessarily consider big, exclusive first-party titles that just kind of ended up being so as a result of some of the companies they acquired. Basically, it hasn't taken people too long to quite literally put 2 and 2 together, and in this case, get the names of the 4 games, which we believe, according to sources such as The Verge and VGC, to be Pentiment, Hi-Fi Rush, Sea of Thieves, and Grounded, a decision that Phil Spencer claimed was made to ensure the long-term health of Xbox. Jonesy, I mean, a lot of questions in there. What do you think about the 4 games and how much sense you think they make, to what do you think of the whole furore around the whole subject now that we know that this is the only thing happening in the immediate future? And also, to what extent do you believe that Phil is right about this being for the long-term health of Xbox? I don't mean to ask you 3 questions at once, but give us your thoughts.
I completely on board with. Let me start with, every time Phil Spencer comes out and confirms or talks about a big, a big button issue from Xbox, I like him more and more with how honest and how direct he is. And I totally believe that when he says it's for the long-term health of Xbox, if you put that together with what they were saying last year about the fact that Xbox has not done as well as the PlayStation and they've quote-unquote lost the console war, I think the long-term health of Xbox is pushing games out to other platforms, specifically onto the Switch, which I think is a fantastic platform for a number of games. Like, for example, Hi-Fi Rush and Pentiment, I think will be fantastic Switch games. And then also, to be fair, like Grounded, I think would be a fine Switch game, and Sea of Thieves, maybe a little less so for that. When you're talking about like graphics and things and how well they're going to run, I don't know at this point on Switch. But for me, with these 4 titles, this really just says that these are test beds for types of games, because you've got like a very well received indie. Well, not indie, I suppose, but you know what I mean. Like Hi-Fi Rush is like
it's like indie in spirit almost.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we've often talked about how you actually classify, but obviously, owned by Xbox is not an indie, but whatever. It's that indie in feel, indie in spirit. Thank you. So you've got a game like that, so they can see how that's going to perform across other platforms. You've then got some of those multiplayer games you talked about in the shape of Grounded and Sea of Thieves. Totally makes sense to put those out and see if they get some more traction with a wider audience, because they're going to be revenue generators for people, games like that in the future. If they can push those out, get wider audience, crossplay, etc., that is the health of the Xbox right there. That's how can we make more money off stuff that we already own the rights to, we can push out. And Pentiment as well. I think Pentiment is I think it's the only one on this list that I haven't I know the least about, I should say, Pentiment. But I remember when you were saying about playing it, you had a lot of good things to say about Pentiment. So again, I think it's another testbed game to say, hey, this game was received well, could be bigger, let's push it out, see how well it does. So even though they've said these 4 games are going to the platforms and they haven't mentioned any others, I just see this as a currently or at the moment, but we'll see a lot more. If these work and if this works for Xbox, then we'll definitely see more games in the future, to join the likes of Call of Duty and oh God, I can't remember the game you just mentioned. Minecraft, yes, thank you. Minecraft and all the other Xbox, every other bloody IP that Xbox own now. Yeah, it totally makes sense for them to push them out.
Sure. I mean, and you're right, because I think Phil, between this business update podcast and some follow-up interviews he did with a few outlets, did kind of say as much. He was asked in the podcast specifically about Starfield and Indiana Jones, because, of course, there were reports in the build-up to this podcast that they had been at least in consideration for PlayStation 5, and he said that they would not be going multi-platform, but in a separate interview, he said, quote, I don't think we as an industry should ever rule out any game going to any other platform. So there is an element of this where I think he was kind of playing both sides. On the one hand, he was putting a bit of a foot down and saying, hey, any of you folks that thought that Starfield and Indiana Jones were all of a sudden going to come to PlayStation and you didn't need to buy an Xbox anymore, pump your brakes. Like, we're still making games for us and we're still trying to make sure Xbox is the best place to play. But at the same time, he is making some pretty loosey-goosey statements when it comes to what their plans might be in the future, such that, if we do arrive at a time, which I think a lot of people probably still do believe we will, where Starfield and Indiana Jones do arrive on PlayStation platforms, then Phil can just point back to this quote and said, hey, I've been honest and open since day one, and I don't think we should rule out any game going to any other platform ever. I don't know if you saw, but he immediately started beating the drum by talking about Helldivers. Did you see that?
Yes, I was actually going to reference that because he very vocally came out and said he doesn't see how it benefits players by effectively not having Helldivers available on Xbox. Something I would completely agree with him. I think I got caught up in that a little bit and tweeted out something saying like, I'm looking forward to the day when we're all about to lose Super Earth and the Xbox gamers will join, and then we, I think I said what an amazing moment in gaming, that history that would be if just as you're about to lose it, Arrowhead Games are like, here come the Xbox players, and then they flood in, and it's literally like reinforcements, and then and there's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of PlayStation bros who've been saying, "Oh, I'd be sick to get the Xbox guys on hand," and there's a lot of Halo memes, and joining and saying about how it'd be really cool for them to sort of join and with Helldivers. So we know that Phil, at his heart, is similar to we often say that we are. It's for the gamers, and we don't really want to what's the word? We don't want to stop anybody from being able to play games. We want as many people to play games in as many ways as possible for the health of the industry, and because we like to play games across many platforms. I would say, I think these two games specifically, though, the reason he may have said no to Starfield and Indiana Jones, if I was going to try and break down why you would mention those two, and you could say that this is because of good business practice, for example, is you want Indiana Jones to only be available on Xbox at least for a time, right? You don't want to say, just wait because Indiana Jones will come to PlayStation, because you want people, if there are any, to have that thick consideration of maybe now is the time to buy an Xbox so that I can play Indiana Jones, right? And this is potentially going to be a massive game for them. So completely appreciate why you would maybe not want to say that's going to come to any other platform at the moment. And when it comes to Starfield, I don't think that's anything to do with Starfield per se. I don't think Starfield going to PlayStation is going to be any skin off their nose. I think maybe that's a wider Bethesda conversation of, do you want people to start to think, oh, just wait and Bethesda games will all come to PlayStation anyway? Or do you want people to think, okay, Starfield was a little bit of a miss, but it's still Bethesda. I still love Bethesda. So maybe the next Bethesda game I'm not going to be able to get on PlayStation. So maybe I should get an Xbox.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second.
No, it's cool. I said, do you think it's a wider conversation that they don't want people to assume Bethesda games are going to be coming to PlayStation? So it's less Starfield, because Starfield is a bit of not a damp squib. I don't want to say that. I like Starfield. A lot of people didn't. But they don't want PlayStation owners to just discount the idea of getting an Xbox completely.
But potentially, although I think they've kind of ended up in a situation now where either going on there, that in itself feels too broad. Because when you're talking about Bethesda, yes, you're talking about those premium, at one point extremely mass market open world RPGs that they make, like Starfield. Then of course, the Fallouts and the Elder Scrolls games before them. But of course, Bethesda encompasses, for example, id and the future of the Doom franchise. And I've seen a lot of people speculate, again, whether with or without knowledge, I don't know, but speculate about the future of Doom. And maybe Doom is a franchise that actually benefits from being day and date on PlayStation, and it's one of those. So I think that even within brackets like Bethesda, and now we can add Activision Blizzard to that, the Xbox, I think they're going to play it fast and loose. And I think in much the same way that these 4 games couldn't necessarily have been predicted at one point in time, but now we kind of understand the case for all of them. I think that maybe their policy is going to be less about hard and fast rules and more about looking at the use cases and the looking at individual titles and saying, this makes sense cross-platform, this doesn't. And then you get more and more granular. Which platforms does it make sense on? How long is the gap between the exclusive Xbox launch and the arrival on other platforms? And I think between that, we're going to see a bunch of stuff. We're going to see things that arrive on Xbox and a year later are on everything, things that arrive on Xbox and never come out to anything else, things that are everything day one. I also think that, for example, PlayStation fans out there need to be wary of the fact that there are going to be things that are Xbox day one and then Xbox and Switch year 2 and never PlayStation.
Right. So
I think they're going to continue to experiment and mix and match with all these variations on, and all this was, I think, was Phil Spencer and the team coming out and almost using these 4 games and using all these talking points as a way of easing Xbox fans into the idea that this is going to happen. This is for the sake of the business, and we'll get into more detail on this later. Other key parts of the business, like Game Pass and the hardware side of the business, which a lot of people were really worried about, are still super important to us, right?
So do you see this then less as a test, which is what I was considering as, and more like the thin end of the wedge?
I think it could be both. I think sometimes tests are the thin end of the wedge just by their nature.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So,
you don't have to follow up with the full wedge if it's not quite working.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I think that Phil was definitely being very careful and very coy when it came to how they announced some of this stuff and how they discussed some of these titles, which franchises were and were not talked about. And I think they are very aware of the fact that the 4 games they have picked all have a case for them that can be made that isn't going to tread on the toes of the hardcore Xbox fans. There are very few Xbox fans out there that are going to be crying themselves to sleep at night because PlayStation players are getting to play Pentiment. There would be considerably more, and they'd still be virgins, don't get me wrong, there'd be considerably more Xbox fans crying themselves to sleep tonight if the next Halo was confirmed to be arriving at PlayStation day and date. You know? And so there are levels to this. But I also think, and I don't know if you agree, that while Phil used the opportunity to say, hey, Starfield and Indiana Jones are not going multi-platform, those conversations have absolutely been had internally. Phil Spencer did not shove those folders or those documents off his desk when they were put there. He read those documents. He saw where the lines were on the graphs. He thought long and hard about it, and they will continue to think long and hard about it. You know, there's a constant battle going on. It's not just for bottom lines and for profits and for revenue and against the other people in the games industry. It's also for hearts and minds. They know that they're fighting on all fronts at all times. And which is why, when you say thin end of the wedge, I think, yeah, to a certain extent, because the other thing is, the other companies are going to keep doing this as well. And that's not my way of saying that I think we're going to get Mario games on an Xboxes or PlayStations in the future, but there's been a lot of chatter about PlayStation and how, their PC policy went from you get these at some point to you get these at the same time. And Helldivers 2 is the first time that's happened, and it's working extremely well for them. And that's going to keep happening. There are going to be more and more PlayStation games that come out on PC day and date, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger revenue driver for them. And I think what Phil's banking on here is there have been times, sorry, I know I'm talking a long time, there have been times where companies have come out and done something too radical and too bold, and the consumers shot them down, and we reflect on them and say, oh, they weren't wrong, they were early.
Yes.
And I think Phil is just being very careful to make sure that this is a case of Xbox not being wrong, but being early. And the longer you wait, the more right you become. And the more right you become, the easier it is to squeeze other things through that ever-growing wedge.
No, agreed. And I think you mentioning Helldivers is apt, because I do think that gives an insight into how he's thinking more broadly, which is the idea of no game, effectively from what he said and the way he seems to be thinking is no game should be absolutely never to any platform. He's thinking, like you said, he's thinking about every game. He's considering every option. He's not just pushing those folders off the table. He's not just outright just saying no to things. I mean, I would find the idea that day and date a new Halo title could come to PlayStation would blow my mind. That would kind of be the end of consoles being protectionist against any of their mainline IP. But I suppose there's potential for one day in the future for that sort of thing to happen. But no, I agree. Like I said, I agree. The Helldivers thing, I'm with it. I think it should go to Xbox. I think that would be really cool. I think crossplay of Xbox would be fantastic. So yeah,
it would be very interesting to watch PlayStation respond to all of this. And PlayStation have had big problems swallowing their pride in the past. You remember even going back to something, it seems so trivial now, but do you remember when crossplay was a huge problem for PlayStation, and they were coming up with all these bizarre excuses about protecting their player bases and all these things, and how painting interconnectivity between a PlayStation 4 or whatever it was at the time and Nintendo's platforms and Xbox's platforms as a threat to their users. And all of a sudden, the biggest games in the world like Minecraft and Fortnite were please, let crossplay be a thing, for fuck's sake. And it took PlayStation a long time to realize how antiquated their kind of we're on top and we don't need anyone else outlook was, and how much, whatever the expression about a rising tide and what it does to all ships, I think can apply here under certain circumstances as much as it could apply and has applied there. And I think that's the drum that Phil continues to bang. And if there's one thing that he has been very consistent on in his messaging throughout his time at head of Xbox, is that like a bigger industry is a better industry for everyone, and it doesn't matter. If you're going to be number 3, be the number 3 in the biggest, most like prolific revenue generating version of the games industry that exists. And I totally see where he's coming from. One of the things that will help them continue at least to stay active in the scene, Jonesy, and not disappear into the ether as some people thought they might do or even wanted them to, is of course Game Pass. Xbox have for a while now been one of, I guess, the industry leaders when it comes to services and subscription services. Game Pass was touched upon in the podcast with a quote that Game Pass quote, will continue to only be available on Xbox platforms, which essentially shoots down any suggestions that it may come to PlayStation or Nintendo systems in the future. Not a shock, right?
Not a shock now.
Yeah, okay.
Not a shock now.
Right.
I don't know when, but I think the idea that Game Pass will be available on Switch and PlayStation, I think that won't be that far off. Like the real, I think not when I say that far off, I'm talking years. I'm not talking
sure. Yeah.
I'm not talking months or a year or even 2 years. More than that. But I can imagine a time when the real sticking point with that is going to be PlayStation saying they don't want it. Like, I think that would happen. I think Xbox would offer it and PlayStation would say no, because, at the end of the day, like you said, PlayStation can be quite funny about that kind of thing. And it's only going to be beneficial to Xbox at that point. And like you said, you might be number 3 in the game's console chart, but actually if you're if you're making the biggest margin, and you're selling it to a lot of people and you're making a lot of profit, it doesn't matter if you're number 3, if you're making, percentage wise, you're making more.
Yep.
It's good. And this is exactly what Phil was saying. It's for the health of Xbox. He doesn't mean it's for the health of the Xbox hardware system. He means it's for the health of Xbox as a company. We always talk about the fact that Xbox, despite repeatedly losing battles, feel like they are at least fighting a war. Whereas PlayStation, Nintendo's a little bit tricky, because Nintendo obviously are a bit of a thing unto themselves, and while they're in such a strong position of being, a very specific platform, and offering a specific kind of way that Switch players especially play, I think.
Yeah.
I think Xbox seem to be thinking of the future, doing that 5 to 10 year planning, as opposed to 1 year, 2 years down the line, which often seems like PlayStation are doing, when they're not thinking ahead. Sometimes it seems with PlayStation.
Right, like we're going to get on to PlayStation a little bit later in the podcast, and there is evidence there. Like again, like PlayStation will have their own sets of analysts and people whose very jobs it is to think about and speculate on the future and make sure that everything about their business plan is as future-proofed as possible. But like there are emerging news stories about how like maybe like things, and of course game development is very complicated, and when you're in the software game, that you have to factor in that long and expensive development times make things harder to predict. But maybe Sony have left themselves a little bit high and dry with regards to how the next 12 months might play out in a way that Xbox aren't quite. But to go back to Game Pass, I think I kind of agree with you that it doesn't seem like something that, if you looked so explicitly at the Sony side of things, the PlayStation would ever want. I think if you painted a picture to a PlayStation executive of someone booting up a PS6, let's say, or a PS5 Pro, and scrolling straight over to the Xbox Game Pass app, launching that app, which they have access to as a result of a subscription fee that they pay to Xbox, and then playing software that was developed in-house at Xbox, that is like allows players to be remonetized through microtransactions that are then lining the pockets of it. It goes back to the whole thing of why Apple don't. There's no. Well, this might change, especially if you live in the EU soon. But there's no Game Pass app on iOS that just lets you download a Game Pass app and just start like streaming games on the back. You have to do it through Safari, because the App Store has its own sets of rules, and Apple have to take slices here and there, and they don't want people spending money in storefronts that exist within their storefront instead of them. And yeah, I think PlayStation would get very weird about it. and ensure it wouldn't happen. But it'd be fascinating to see Xbox get to the point where they want it to happen, because Phil would no doubt do another interview, as he always does, and make them look bad, even if they don't give a shit. I suppose the other element to talk about, Jonesy, though, is hardware. We presumed, even with everything going on a couple of weeks ago, that Xbox weren't going to pull out of the hardware game immediately, but how they were going to handle the hardware scene, that was, and I guess is still to a certain extent, a bit of an unknown. But Sarah Bond, who was present on the podcast, of course now Xbox president, shared a little bit more on that front, implying that more hardware was in the works. There's a quote here saying, "There's some exciting stuff coming out in hardware that we're going to share this holiday, and we're also invested in the next generation roadmap." And then this is the kind of the interesting one, Jonesy. And what we're really focused on there is delivering the largest technical leap you will have ever seen in a hardware generation, which makes it better for players and better for creators and the visions that they're building. So, again, Xbox and Sarah Bond not just committing to the a next generation hardware roadmap, but claiming to be working on the biggest or the largest technical leap that we will have ever seen in a hardware generation, at a point where there are a lot of conversations about diminishing returns when it comes to leaps in console generations. How do you feel about that? Those bold words from Miss Bond?
I feel like they're like a little bit tricky, those words, because you hear those words and I think you're immediately going to think, I'm going to see the biggest leap technologically from one generation to another. But the reality is you're not. You're never going to see a leap like the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2 ever again.
Right.
Exactly for the reasons you said. It's the diminishing returns from technology. Like if you go from 4K to 8K, sure, you've just made an absolutely monumental leap. If you were hitting 60 FPS at 8K, we would all gasp at the fact that they've managed to actually hit that, like because of hardware. But actually, when you look at that as a gamer, it's not going to compare to the difference between watching, like sub 15 frames a second at like for like less than 500 like pixels. We're never going to see the kind of leaps ever again that we saw when we were in our youth, just because the diminishing returns, the nature of computing, all of that sort of stuff, unless they start to go to paradigm shifting technologies which are probably tens of years off, like quantum consoles and stuff like that. Like I think we're so far away from seeing stuff. I think you can be correct, and I guess that I would imagine that she is technically correct in what she's saying, but I would imagine that the actual execution is going to be a little bit lackluster if you took it on board.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like, it's fascinating seeing them make statements that are made that could absolutely be technically true, and they could legally put that on the front of the box, and yet it will never manifest itself in a way that most regular consumers will recognize and say, oh yeah, that is the biggest. What was the exact quote? The biggest, the largest technical leap I've ever seen in the hardware generation. Because as you said, like we most of us now have lived through the transitions from 2D graphics to 3D polygonal graphics and into the HD era, and for a while there we were getting so much more bang for our buck year on year. It goes to show, one thing that is interesting now is, I think, in terms of pixel pushing and resolutions, we're getting to the point where like a lot of games can hit a native 4K, or just about like claim to hit a native 4K, even if they do use some form of upscaling or whatever the case may be. It's interesting that we're reaching the point now where there is no real need or desire to go beyond that point. Not from the consumer side, and not even from the the television sales side of things yet. Like, they're not pushing. No one's really pushing 8K at the moment. It exists, but no one's pushing it hard. So we've seen them go down other routes before. Like HDR was obviously a big one, but I'm always fascinated to see what kind of like the generational USPs are, I guess. And part of me hopes that one of the ways that we can claw back a little bit of the at least the perceived technical leap is more of that stuff being representative in game. And like we've talked before about potential advances in like AI and load times, and the amount of stuff that can be stored in like in short term or fast access memory and stuff like that, to create these experiences that begin to that was basically, there's a feeling sometimes that what actually gets delivered in terms of console generations is always one step, that they're always one step behind what we actually get. Like the thing they pitch is a thing they're actually going to fully deliver on the following generation. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So like when they started talking about 4K, we had to wait another generation before we could before 4K was a thing. And I think I hope that what happens is, I remember PlayStation 5 was, a lot of the talk was power, not power you can see, but power you can feel. Right. And there were hints at that. And of course, that was in itself a weird sort of like reference to the dual sense and haptic feedback and all that kind of stuff. And I get that. But there were also, we talked about swing speeds in Spider-Man being off the hook and load times being so short that they're not even load times. And some of that stuff, some games, some developers made good on all those elements. But I still think there is room to be explored in terms of okay, we're not trying to make games look any better now. We're trying to make games play as well as we can using the tools at our disposal. I think that would be really cool and begin to represent a more believable, a more believable sense of the quote unquote largest technical leap you'll have ever seen in a hardware generation.
I think for me as well, it's not that the hardware is not the thing now. Like the biggest leap we're going to see, and I think everyone will notice, and it will be mind blowing when it comes off fully, is the AI. Is the AI utilization in game to have like dynamic NPCs who can interact with you and actually relate to you, to exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it. Is to have the actual reality of branching storylines that do work and do branch. Like we talked about Dying Light 2, for example, and a lot of other games that said that they were going to have these branching storylines and the worlds were going to be reactive to how you actually played in game. And always the joke is that the reality is, as they're in development, we all joke about the fact that we know it's not going to happen because it's just simply not possible, because it's that squaring of, they need this many reactions to this thing you did and then this thing, and you end up with 1 billion outcomes down the line for this for a branching storyline. But the reality is with AI, if they implement the software correctly, it becomes possible, because you don't have to write 1 billion different lines of dialogue and have 1 billion different outcomes. The AI can generate it if it's good enough on the fly. But again, that's all software based, and that's not the hardware of the Xbox having to do the heavy lifting. That's the hardware at the developer and and getting the software and getting the prompts and the AI and all of that stuff working. And so
they are doing, like Ubisoft have got Ubisoft, specifically what you were mentioning there. Ubisoft have got like kind of Bark and like Combat Shout writing AI already in place.
Wasn't it, we were talking about as well with the is it the what is it called? The finals?
Yeah, the finals.
The finals was and their utilization of some AI dialogue that they've with commentators and things like that. Like it's coming for sure. It's coming. The degree it's used is at the moment is questionable, and even when it is used, I think it's obviously used sparingly because it's not there yet. But yeah, like as for the hardware being the most technically, the biggest technical leap you'll ever seen, is like yeah. I might see it, but I'm not going to see it, if you know what I'm saying.
Sure. No, yeah, absolutely. We are going to see the number of teraflops that someone at Digital Foundry tells us it is. We are not necessarily going to notice, it's also like that thing of sometimes a certain generation swan song can be so good because of how much developers are able to squeeze out of a then old piece of hardware,
right?
That the first batch of games on a new piece of hardware sometimes also just look the same as what we were already playing. And like again, like we've done this little exercise before, but you can go to sort of looking at developers' works across the span of a generation and how much they improved as developers. Like the easiest example is, it's horrible to say out loud because of what's happened since, but like Naughty Dog, for example, being able to make the entire Uncharted trilogy and The Last of Us all in the space of how many years would that have been? 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And how much better they got at utilizing the power, the same volume of power available over the course of that generation. So there will be a bit of that as well, that we will get the best looking PS5 Pro and Xbox Series X games imaginable that release, and then 6 months later a new console comes out that people are just starting to get used to. There was one final tidbit of news, Jonesy. Xbox popping a cherry of sorts by confirming that Diablo 4 would be the first Activision Blizzard game to be added to Game Pass. Obviously, that released last summer, so they did give it a fairly big window, big enough that hopefully the people who bought the copy of that game on Steam, for example, don't feel too hard done by. But not only is it a relatively big, relatively popular, and still, as weird as it is to remember, critically acclaimed title to be able to bring to Game Pass, it also, again, is the beginning of Xbox seemingly figure out something of a roadmap for the releases of new and future Activision Blizzard games. It's a good pull. Is it something that you'd go and check out, having not played D4 at launch, or are you over it? I know D3 left you jaded, shall we say?
The thing with me in Game Pass is if it's on Game Pass, I probably will, and it will come down to that of I'll give it a go. D3 left me wanting, and you and Jamie had a bit of interesting reactions to D4. I think
Jamie.
Sorry, you and Chris had interesting reactions to D4 where you both seem to like it, but not that much.
Yes,
which doesn't make me think something I really need to play. But if I'm already paying for Game Pass, then why not?
Yes, and that's the most important bottom line to end on, I guess. I feel like, I think Jeff Gerstmann summed it up really nicely the other day, and so I'm just going to copy what he said. I think Diablo 4 is a really good game if you just play it once and then stop. Don't know, but I don't think Chris would even go that far, which is pretty damning. But you're right, it's there and you've paid for it. It's one of those things that you might as well take advantage of, just like you could take advantage of all kinds of goodies if you were already subscribed to a very particular, very enticing and alluring and helpful service of sorts. Of course, I'm talking about the SuperShow Patreon. That's right, this podcast at this point is entirely made possible by the fine folks who have gone over to patreon.com/SuperShow and shown their support by helping us out and pledging anywhere from $2 a month to $5 a month to $10 a month just to help keep this show on the roads. We are eternally grateful for everyone that has supported us over there, past, present, and future. And of course, the people that have headed over there and pledged a little bit of money will have seen that there are rewards and various bits and pieces and goodies that you get access to when you do pledge, for everything from Discord access to Patreon-exclusive videos, Patreon-exclusive podcasts. It's all over there. It's all going to live there forever. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, the link, once again, patreon.com/SuperShow. Take a look, and just thank you in advance for checking out and considering helping the show. And there are some people who have gone further than just considering it. They have pledged to indeed help the show. There are some names of those fine folk on screen right now. So thank you to each and every one of them. And I would also like to give a slightly more personal shout out to Aaron Cameron, Athletic Gravy, Brimstone, Ice Not Rock Salt, Jesper Kamdal Nielsen, Pastors Guild. And then, of course, we have the big dogs, the head honchos, the members of the board, Brett Z, aka Shellshock, Geometric Potter, Hacksaw Book Read, Manuel Guerrero, and Peacewad. Thank you all so much. And Jonesy, do you know what? I won't claim to be the best, in terms of, let's say, the most regular visitor to the Discord, but I do make something of an effort every now and then just to check in and see what people are chatting about. And I will say I found it incredibly useful this week for us to exploit our position as hosts of a podcast to draft in reinforcements on the Helldivers front. We were able to finally create our Helldivers 2 voice chat this past week, and as I said, drafting our first privates, our first recruits. I feel bad calling them privates because at least one of them is significantly more leveled than me. So shout out to all the folks who are helping us push back and for showing that they are as in favor of democracy as we are. I'm trying to think of something to tell them, right? I don't know.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that was really good to hop on and join forces with some of the guys in the Discord, and like you say, hop into the voice chat and talk to them as we did it. Yeah, and grateful as well to them for showing me some of the ropes, for at least, and not being too annoyed when I blew them up with a 120mm cannon barrage. So there we go.
Yeah. Turns out that Jonesy, for anyone that none of you would necessarily know this, having not played with him, Jonesy is a stratagem first, ask questions later kind of player when it comes to Helldivers 2. So he is already mashing his D-pad before he's even begun thinking about opening his mouth, which makes our operations against bugs and robots alike extremely interesting. So. Yeah, if that sounds like your cup of tea, if you want to play with if you want to play Helldivers with a guy who looks like he's screen recording to send it into the Jackass crew and pitch himself as the latest cast member, then you know which Discord to join. Anyway, Jonesy, let's we've spoken a little bit about Xbox, their trials and tribulations, and their future for better and for worse. Why don't we swing things over to the other side and talk about the big blue company that is PlayStation?
Let's do it.
All right. The real kind of headline emerged kind of in the past week as a result of what seemed like, I think it was kind of the PlayStation and Sony sharing their financial results. So namely, it was something that was mostly for investors more than anything else. But of course, we always come away with some tidbits. I'm just not sure the tidbits that we came away with this time were to people's liking. Before we get to the headline that did the rounds and I think scared some people, a brief chatter about what is actually going on with the financials and the reason for it. And essentially, Jonesy, this boils down to a conversation about a decline in PS5 sales and the fact that now Sony are now warning their investors and shareholders and everyone who it pertains to that we may have actually reached the peak when it comes to PS5 sales, certainly in a given year, and we are now at the point of the generation where the PS5 sales will begin to sort of trail off and sell fewer and fewer units year on year, allowing for some wiggle room, of course, according to depending on sales and the launches of massive pieces of software, and of course the launches of potential other pieces of hardware, which we'll loop back around to in just a moment. But in the company's financial results for the 3 months that ended on December 31st, so just in the run-up to the end of the year, Sony did have another record quarter in terms of revenue, and PS5 sales reached 54.7 million. But the key part is the part that investors and shareholders care about. They lowered their sales forecast for the year after they fell slightly behind in what was a pretty lofty hardware target. In the latest quarter, they sold 8.2 million consoles, bringing the total for the year so far to 16.4, and the original target was 21 million, so they expect to fall short of their original target by at least 4 million units, which, but I mean, it's not a huge amount, but again, Josie, if like that's the beginning of a downward trend, if that's what they're identifying there, then that's where it becomes a key piece of information.
Yeah, and I think, and we've talked about it, I think last week we sort of mentioned it in that Sony haven't been doing everything maybe that we would have hoped at this point to get, top line first party titles out, the ones that, make you think, okay, I really need to buy a PlayStation 5. If I haven't got one already, I really need to buy one. Or even if you're at that point where you're thinking, like in my case, for example, I've now got a broken PlayStation 5 with a disc drive that I would love to replace. I would love to replace and buy a new one, but I know at this point in the life cycle of the console that I'm better off waiting for the PlayStation 5 Pro than I am about pulling the trigger and buying another one, another PlayStation 5 now. And so I'm going to hold off. There's no games that are making me feel like I have to buy one now. I have to replace it now. And I think a lot of people will be having those same sort of thoughts.
Yes, especially on the games front, because, I mean, you talk about there being no games out there on sale at the moment that are making you feel a draw to go and replace your PlayStation 5. It seems like that's going to be the case for a little while going forward as well, because after talking about what they described as a gradual decline in unit sales from next fiscal year onwards for the consoles, they began talking about software, and this is the quote that got a few people's knickers in a twist. Regarding first-party software, we aim to continue to focus on producing high-quality productions and producing live service games. But while major projects are currently in development, we do not plan to release any new major existing franchise titles until next fiscal year, like God of War Ragnarok and Marvel Spider-Man 2. For anyone wondering what the next fiscal year in question means, that means basically nothing before March of 2025, all but confirming from the time of recording onwards an entire 12 months of nothing in the way of what Sony at least considered to be new major existing franchise titles. So if you're expecting, I don't even know what people were expecting. Like, I know people weren't expecting another God of War or another Uncharted or another don't get me wrong, people weren't sitting around saying one of those big things will happen in the next 12 months. But it does open up this very interesting conversation, Jonesy, about, well, then what are the titles that might come that aren't new major existing franchise titles? Like, which franchises aren't major? Or about developers that are working on things that aren't existing franchises? We know that, for example, and like this is maybe a little bit too premature, but Sony Bend, developers of Days Gone, they're working on something completely new. So that's not an existing franchise. We also know that there are plenty of other franchises out there that, when you're talking about the God of Wars and Spider-Mans of the world, aren't major. And in fact, I've got a quote here from Giant Bomb reporter Jeff Grubb, who said, "I've heard maybe Astro," referring to Astrobot, does happen this year. So if that happens, that's pretty big for me. I get why Sony's not thinking that's a major one, at least not yet. Hopefully they could turn it into a major one, a lot of that, and a lot of this changes around. The idea being that because it's not going to sell, or is not projected to sell 15, 20 million units, that an Astrobot game could still come out in the next year. How do you feel about, well, Sony, it's not even pessimism, Sony's honesty, perhaps, regarding upcoming titles and what we might be able to see for the next 12 months in the meantime? Of course, including live service games, we still expect, the Concords and fail-safes of the world to be part of that output too.
Yeah, I suppose, but I wasn't expecting any, I suppose. Like, Wolverine is probably the next big first-party game that they're going to be releasing. Like, and we know that was going to come next year anyway. Like, we weren't expecting that this fiscal year. So,
yep, agreed.
It wasn't like there was anything in the pipeline that it's not like they were going to shadow drop Ghost of Tsushima 2, for example.
The only thing I would say was that a year's long enough that if someone like Sucker Punch had been away for as long as they have, which is now 4 years or so, if they came out, like, let's say in the state of play that's just gone, and I know they haven't, but if they came out in that state of play and said Ghost of Tsushima is now been announced targeting Christmas 2024, I'd be like, okay, that would have, that's closing on a 5-year development cycle, which seems logical for a sequel of a game of that size. I maybe believe that, but
I could have done.
Broadly speaking, I agree.
If they had more irons in the fire, in general, I would have said that's possible. But I mean, the fact, like, the last day of play was pretty, wasn't that great. And we were already talking about DS2 being the next big thing, and that's not coming out until we know back at least next year. So it's kind of, I'm not that surprised. And at the same time, like, we've talked a long time about an Astrobot game would be fantastic. Like, we would be all over it. So if they're not considering that to be major, so that doesn't fall in that remit. You talk about like Helldivers 2, I imagine wouldn't fall in that remit either.
Yep.
So there's definitely scope there for them to release things that are very good, that we're going to really enjoy, but they don't class this, because this is the other thing. We're just talking about existing IP. So as you've said,
right,
we
could
well get new IP, and maybe being a little bit sneaky by phrasing it in this particular way. But again, the phase of the life cycle of the console we're in, I don't think it's that surprising. Like, I don't think
I see, that's where I disagree. Like, I think I don't think having a mid-generation lull is a normal thing. I think lulls happen and sometimes protracted lulls happen at the beginning of a generation. I think once you find your feet, like the idea of the, like, what is this, the fourth? Is this the, whatever it is, the third or fourth year? I'm bad at, like, it came out at the end of 2020, so it's been 3 and a bit years, but it's in the fourth year, I think I'm right in saying, technically. The idea of the fourth year of a console generation being the weakest one, I think that's a bad look, and I don't think that's a normal thing.
No, you're right. I mean, you are right. It's not a good thing to have, right? Because I guess this is the kind of time when you want to have a decent amount of strength, because you don't want people to start considering other options. So you don't want a bit of a lull in the middle, but whereas toward the end. But then But then I do wonder if part of this is because I'm not that interested in some of the games that they do have coming, which they've already announced.
Rise of Ronin, Stellar Blade, those kind of things. Yeah.
And maybe that's just a me. Maybe that's a me problem in that they're like, a lot of people are thinking that
I don't think
some titles.
No, I don't think that they are a you problem. I think it goes same as Helldivers 2. I agree that I don't think those are things that Sony consider a part of this major existing franchises or even major franchises sort of remit. Like I think Sony have probably very accurate and very honest sales expectations for those titles, and they're probably aligned with how excited people like you and me are for them,
Yeah. But I mean, it does. Yeah, it always sucks if you're like particularly looking. Like, for example, an announcement of a Last of Us Part 3 would be phenomenal. A God of War, a final to the God of War sort of little trilogy would be fantastic. And the fact that, we're not. I would imagine we're maybe not even going to hear anything about these games until next year either. Stuff that is getting made, and even if we don't even hear anything about Ghost of Tsushima at all this year, that would suck.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we in? We're nearly in March. I'm just trying to think. Like they could still get me super excited just with marketing stuff for some big titles that are coming out back end of 25, and I would still be pretty excited. And I would then give them a pass, and then people are getting annoyed at me because they're like, "You were slagging off Sony being not very good, and now you're giving them a pass." Yeah. And I absolutely would do if they were just announcing some decent games. I don't know.
No,
maybe
you do make a very good point, because again, when you review the quote and what was actually said, they said, "We do not plan to release any new major existing franchise titles." Obviously, between games like Death Stranding 2 and GTA 6, like some of the most widely anticipated games in the world right now are already touting themselves as 2025 titles. There's absolutely nothing stopping Sony having shows from the summer and beyond, really, that are announcing and promoting and getting people excited for games that come out in 2025. And it may actually end up working in their favor to kind of like eat a bit of a hit in the short term, as like maybe hardware sales are on the decline for the first time. There's maybe a want for a few more major first-party titles. But if they are waiting for certain stars to align, or you're releasing a bunch of games and going back to some of these major franchises in 2025 and beyond, and perhaps also releasing a console that may or may not take advantage of some of the features and technical superiorities of these titles, that could be one nice big holistic, neatly packaged business plan that they could be working on. Of course, I am not so subtly referring to a console that both you and I have already referred to openly this podcast, Jonesy, a potential PlayStation 5 Pro, which I think most people do expect to be a reality at some point. But the news that has also come out this week is that some analysts believe that it may well be releasing in late 2024, and it will feature a proprietary DLSS-like solution, which I guess, Jonesy, goes back to what you were saying about, in a weird roundabout way, hardware-accelerated AI, for want of a better way of putting it, with the deep learning element of DLSS. Analysts have now reportedly told CNBC that Sony is, quote-unquote, likely to launch a refreshed version of the console in the second half of this year. I've got a quote here that says, "There seems to be a broad consensus in the game industry that Sony is indeed preparing a launch of a PS5 Pro in the second half of 2024. That comes from Serkan Toto, who is the CEO of a Tokyo-based games consultancy firm called Kantan Games. The rest of the quote kind of goes over some of what we were saying, Jonesy. Sony will want to make sure to have a great piece of hardware ready when GTA 6 launches in 2025, and that will be a shot in the arm for the entire game industry. I guess it does make sense and does stand to reason that between the launch of titles like GTA 6 and what we're speculating about with the return of these major franchises in 2025 and beyond, that Sony will have a piece of hardware out there on store shelves, ready-made to take advantage of all of those games that are flying off shelves at the same time. But I suppose the major pinch of salt that comes with all of this is that we're not talking about insiders or rumor mongers like usual. We're talking about, a game consultancy firm and quote-unquote analysts, people who, are paid by magazines and outlets and so on and so forth, and sometimes companies themselves, just to make predictions loosely based on historical events and what they might think happens. So while usually we're here talking about people who have heard something from someone who's broken an NDA, now we're just talking about a guy who has a hunch. But is it a hunch that you buy into, I guess, is what I'm wondering, Jonesy.
Yeah, to 100%. The only thing that makes me question the timing is I'm completely bought into the fact that they're gonna drop a PS5 Pro, and one of the reasons they're not that bothered about dropping any new big first party IP related games is because they were like, well, hold on, we want to push the PS5 Pro along with whatever it is. But the only thing that makes me question it is if they're talking about the latter half of 2024, is surely you want some chunky games or a game at least to launch with that,
right?
In order to give people the impetus to go out there and buy it. I could see that being an Astrobot game, like as a little nod to the release of the PlayStation 5, and Astrobot being a fantastic showcase of the power of the PlayStation 5, especially the haptic feedback on the DualSense controller. I don't think an Astrobot game would be enough. I would assume that wouldn't be enough. I could, for example, we had Spider-Man's Miles Morales, which was the real kind of like, you need to get Astrobot, you need to get Miles Morales. These are the PlayStation 5 games. They're not even main games. Like Miles Morales was like a midway game for the Spider-Man series, and obviously Astrobot was not like a AAA game. It was a showcase game. But that so to me, I'm wondering if there's some shenanigans with wording, and actually the Pro doesn't come out the latter half of 2024, but actually comes out in first quarter 25, and we see some games drop in after that March cutoff of the new fiscal year, and actually there's a couple of games ready lined up to go in April of 2025, and the PS5 Pros come out, so it's the perfect time. It's like a perfect storm of grab this, grab that, blah, blah, get your PlayStation 5 Pro. That would make more sense to me. Like, I don't really see the point of dropping a PS5 Pro in the latter half of 2024 with no games for it.
I tend to agree.
But I'm not an analyst.
No one. And what, you know what? Like, neither am I. And so I like, it's hard to say for sure. I think if this were a traditional console launch, like then there'd be absolutely no question that what you're saying is 100% correct. Like point blank, like the games lineup alongside a console launch is vital. I think there's something about these half-step consoles that feels slightly different. It's funny because it reminds me of the kind of the phone comparison, which a lot of developers or sort of console manufacturers were trying to make at the time. I remember when they were saying it was almost like that there were individuals, maybe execs, whoever at PlayStation and Xbox, for example, who were jealous of Apple and who were sat there saying, hang on a second, they can make these literally $1,000 mobile phones, cellular phones, and sell a new one every year. We make these $500 consoles, and people question us when we want to make one every 7, and they were getting so jealous. And there was this idea that the half-step console, the PS4 Pro and the Xbox Series Xbox One X, excuse me, God, thank you for Xbox and their naming conventions. There was some talk about that being like those console manufacturers' foray into mobile style, more sort of like minor upgrades and like encouraging users to get consumers to get more used to a slightly more constant cycle of console releases.
Yeah,
didn't really happen. But like one of the things that reminded me of is that when you get a new iPhone, you're told it's more powerful. You can do more things at the same time and do them more faster as well. But you don't open up. But how many times have you opened up a new iPhone, got it all set up, and said, "Oh shit, there's nothing for me to try." Like it's just the same stuff I always do. I can open up WhatsApp and read through old messages, but like there's no killer app for me to test, for me to verify the fact that this iPhone, the first iPhone I've just bought in 3 years, is 17 times more powerful than the one I was using yesterday. I just have to kind of take their word for it. There's a bit of that with the half-step consoles, where the fact that they are just a half step up from, say, the PlayStation 5 in this case, that there's not this immediate expectation of a killer app arriving day and day. And certainly, I can remember the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X equally launching at a time where you were like, what am I meant to, like, how do I know that this is good? Like, I remember one of the first ones for me was Horizon Zero Dawn. That came out end of February 2017, and the console had launched in mid-November. And so I would make the argument that one of Sony's first PS4 Pro showcases arrived, midway through Q1, having released the console in the previous Q4. So I think there is similar things happened with the One X. I hope that if anyone can actually remember, maybe leave a comment. But like, I had this vague memory of the Xbox port of PUBG technically being the only Xbox One X game at launch, or something weird like that. Yeah, so it's happened before, and it can happen again. Was all that was a long-winded way of saying that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it is a case of it doesn't matter if there's anything ready to drop, because it's a case of get your hands on it, ready for GTA 6, ready for Wolverine. Like, you don't,
Yes,
and
yeah.
then and actually maybe for them even works even better, because they don't want the rush. For people trying to order units and having shortages, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, no,
right, exactly.
Maybe.
One of the arguments we hear all the time about these half-step consoles is like, yes, there are people who, with a fully functioning PS5, will go out on day one and upgrade to a PS5 Pro because they feel like they need that experience. But a lot of their sort of like catchment area, a lot of the people they're going for are people who are exactly like you, who at one point will need or want, for any number of reasons, a new PS5, or buy a PS5 for a family member or a friend, or their one broke, or any number of things can happen. And it's those people who go to the market fresh who are then presented with two options, who are then more likely to buy the more expensive one because, whatever reason they're coming to the market is. And, you are a case in point example of that, which is that you're a PS5 user with a broken disk drive. You will eventually buy a new console, but you're going to wait and buy a more expensive one,
Yes, exactly. Because I would feel kind of silly buying a PS5 Pro just for a PS5 just for a PS5 Pro to come out 6 months later, yes. and then I'd feel a little bit silly.
Yes, exactly. And I think there are people who do, and there are people who don't. Like, then there are some people who are going to take their PS5 to the dying day, much like they took their PS4 to the dying day. And I still remember, stories of OG PS4s playing The Last of Us Part 2 and sounding like they were going to literally explode. But that's the road we've been down before. I'm sure it's a road we're going to go down again. A road, though, Jonesy, seemingly avoided by Nintendo, because every now and then I bust out my Nintendo Switch and play some games like Tears of the Kingdom that should theoretically be pushing it to its limits, and yet it doesn't sound like it's about to explode in my hands. And yet, despite, according to the amount of noise being made by fans and various other components, there's still being some room there, a little bit of leverage, a little bit more wiggle room that isn't stopping Nintendo pushing ahead with their plans for a new console. The twist in the tale, though, Jonesy, is that it could launch later than expected. I can't remember when it was, but at some point, we all started talking about the Nintendo Switch 2, let's call it, the Nintendo Switch successor, as something that was probably going to happen this year. In fact, I feel like even when we were recording podcasts, you and I, right at the tail end of last year and the top of this year, making kind of predictions and that kind of stuff, it almost felt like the Switch 2 happening this year was an open secret,
Yes. It's also
about time.
It did, and it's also a thing with the Switch that you can totally foresee them trying to get ahead of holiday season. Like Christmas 2024 would have been a perfect time. And so, yeah, it kind of made sense. Christmas 2025 would seem far too late. And it seems like a perfect launch date would be, just before Christmas 2024, but apparently not so.
Well, apparently not so, or at least apparently not a realistic one. Whilst, that 2024 target may well have been nice, may well have been the plan at one point, it now appears that the successor to Nintendo Switch is targeting Q1 of 2025. That's initially, according to a Brazilian journalist called Pedro Henrique Lutilipe, which is a fantastic name.
That's a cool name.
Yes, they claimed that they had received information from 5 separate sources, which is good journalism work. Shout out to Pedro Enrique. It's worth noting for anyone that doesn't trust, though, Pedro Enrique's word alone. Eurogamer was since able to substantiate and to verify those claims. They were then followed up by VGC, who also claimed to hear from multiple sources who said Nintendo has been telling publishers its next console will now launch in Q1 2025. And then to complete the trifecta of confirmed rumor people, Bloomberg later corroborated the news as well. So all the major outlets who traditionally put their money where their mouth is when it comes to rumors have now done so. And it seems, Jonesy, much like the original Switch launched in March of that year, we could be talking about another kind of like late Q1 launch for the Switch's successor, which supposedly, if you believe the rumors, if you believe the chatter, is to allow for basically a bigger launch in terms of the number of games and the variety of software available at launch. It seems like they were working on some games internally at Nintendo that are now targeting Q1 2025. Obviously, they've shared this information with publishers who I'm sure will align their release dates to make sense with it as well. Could still mean that, put it this way, launching Q1 didn't hurt the original Switch. So, probably still going to be a very healthy window for Nintendo.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Nintendo are a thing unto themselves, and you've got to believe that with an install base like they've got with the Switch, when it comes to Switch 2, it's going to be massive again, isn't it? Although they don't have, obviously Switch went kind of crazy with lockdown and with COVID and with a number of titles. Animal Crossing, a number of pushing sales. But yeah, realistically, I suppose they're not really worried. Probably whenever they release, but this is the thing we were just saying. It makes sense to release a console when you've got games to play on it. And so for them waiting for some titles totally makes sense. You just got to hope that everyone doesn't spend all their money on Xboxes at the Christmas before.
Oh, that is definitely the number one thing that Nintendo are worried about. Oh no, what if no one buys the new Switch because they all bought Xboxes? That when actually what Nintendo don't realize is the most damaging thing they can do to the Nintendo Switch, if history has taught us anything, is call it the wrong name. Like if they give that thing a shit name and like completely fuck up the chatter around it, like as they did. I'm referring to the Wii U indirectly here, but if they pull another Wii U where no one knows what it is, what it does, why it does it, whether or not it's associated or affiliated with, or even an accessory for the previous console, like I really hope they don't fuck it again. For their sake.
Do you think, because we've talked about this before, but do you think that they can just upgrade the screen, make it more powerful, and that will be enough for a Switch 2? Or do you think they will Nintendo it and they'll come out with like some weird thing?
I think they will Nintendo it because Nintendo's it. But I've got a feeling this is going to be the least amount that they Nintendo it by maybe ever. Okay. Like you look at the jump from the GameCube to the Wii to the Wii U to the Switch, and you're like, are these consoles made by the same people? What the fuck is going on? At some point, they will have just noticed that their rivals are, yes, in some cases, not doing quite as well. But like they'll have noticed that when they watch the trajectory of the PlayStation, the Xbox, it's that like, hey, it turns out you can get away with releasing something that's functionally identical, just better. And yes, the highs might not be as high, but as Nintendo also know, the lows might not be as low. And maybe the middle ground between the roaring success of the Wii and the utter disaster that was the Wii U is just to make something familiar, make something that is immediately identifiable, but make something that's better. I still think that you've got to leave the window open for Nintendo to find some kind of bizarre USP. And I have no doubt that like early on in 2025, we're going to see a very strange live action advert where a bunch of people who feel way too old to be meeting up exclusively for the purpose of playing video games locally are going to be sat on a rooftop and doing something with the Switch successor that we look at and go, okay, I'm never going to do that, but I will play those games. So that's
4 Switches back to back to back with people playing all over.
Yes, just something weird, or like some weird thing where like if you put the ends of 2 Switches together, you get a Switch XL that lets you do, like it's like Just stop it.
That
Just stop it.
they're mod. You can hook them together, and you look like four together, and you get a massive screen.
Exactly, yeah. And then all of a sudden, someone's making like an 8x8 Switch, and it's
That would be amazing. And they've got some new technology where you can't even see the join.
oh yeah, like it renders something in the bevels somehow, and it combines the processing power, the hardware of all the units that you add together, so they can actually display things in like native 4K. And like now we're going down a weird rabbit hole. I guarantee you, there's someone at Nintendo, for example, not this generation but future generations, who's already looking at like bendable and foldable screen technology.
I was just thinking,
oh my
foldable.
god.
I was
Like imagine if it's like a foldable Nintendo Switch, so that when you kind of like the Game Boy Advance SP, except obviously both sides would have some screen element on them, and this idea is, oh my god, what if we made something that was the size of the Switch Lite, but when you folded it, it fit in the average pocket?
I could totally imagine them doing that. 100%.
But then that gets away from what some people want, because there is, and I don't know if this is. Do you think this is our kind of echo chamber, or actually what people want, where I go on Twitter and people are excited about replaying Breath of the Wild in 4K 60 frames a second? There's a weird appetite out there for the games that Nintendo have been making recently, and presumably will continue to make, at higher resolutions and higher frame rates. You look at the Switch Deck. One of the things, the Steam Deck, fucking hell. One of the things that's really popular on the Steam Deck is Switch emulation, because like you can get these really, sometimes the frame rates, the performance is poor, but you get these really nice sharp versions of games that you can't get anywhere. And if you're really willing to get in the weeds and do some very light hacks, then you can get better versions of Pokemon than Nintendo will ever give you ever. Like, there is an appetite for that, and I don't know if Nintendo will tap into it or not.
There is, but there's also the weird angle that if they just manage to make a... So we were saying before, when it comes to Xbox and them saying about, the biggest technical leap, Switch don't have to make, or Nintendo, sorry, don't have to make as much of a leap with the Switch 2 to actually close the gap quite a lot. And when we talk about games like The Witcher 3 coming to Switch, and how, wow, that game's going to look like trash, and it did, and that's that's a thing. But hey, if the Switch 2 comes out and The Witcher 3 looks really nice, you start to get into a strange world where actually the Switch 2 becomes a viable alternative to something like the Steam Deck. And so the Steam Deck think they're being clever. People think they're being clever using the Steam Deck to get upscale versions of Nintendo games. But what if the Switch 2 just actually becomes a damn good system to play games on handheld, and they look fantastic? And then you start to consider, like, I would often sort of say, well, I'm never going to play that on the Switch. But if you start to make the consideration of, actually, Xbox are bringing a lot of their games to the Switch now, and they look very good, and you can play them handheld, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper than the Steam Deck. And I like the way that I like the way that the Switch feels. And suddenly you've got a very viable system, and it's blimey, especially if you can plug it into a TV and it looks good on the TV. I think it would. So then we start to get into a weird world where technical advances in consoles suddenly mean something again, because Nintendo aren't that bothered about that sort of stuff.
Yes,
usually.
Well, they're just they're incredibly hard to predict. I guess that's all I'm thinking as I kind of like as let those thoughts rummage around in my head, is that we can never be surprised in which way they go, and how they show off the console, or even which games they choose to show it off with. I guess that's another question. Is are there any particular titles, sequels, returning franchises that you'd like to see in that launch window for the Switch 2? I know a lot of people are saying that it feels like we have been waiting an awful long time for another 3D Mario since Odyssey.
Yeah, I would quite like to see like a Luigi's Mansion or something like that. Would be pretty cool.
Okay, that would be cool, yeah.
See something like that as a launch.
I think that last one was, about 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was a decent while ago. Yeah.
No, actually... no, I'm just tripping over myself.
Like 3D Mario, that's an easy one, but I don't know. Is that wishing for too much for something?
Odyssey was Odyssey will turn 7 years old this year. Like, it's been a while.
But then we always joke about the fact that Nintendo like to re-release games and get as much out of them as possible. So whenever we're trying to think, like Odyssey blew me away. Like Odyssey was fantastic. I was genuinely shocked of how much, how much of Odyssey I absolutely loved. And the idea that we could, even if it's an Odyssey 2, it should be eminently doable. But at the same time, I'm like, would Nintendo do that, or would Nintendo just release 15 different Mario games from yesteryear?
I mean,
just upscaled or like better resolution.
I get that, but I think they're like that with certain franchises and not like others. And I do think, in much the same way that like Zelda has been handled very carefully, I think Mario is still handled very carefully, and they use offshoots of what people see as the mainstays of these franchises as ways to kind of like Zelda in between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is where they did other kind of weird stuff, and they went back and remade Link's Awakening or whatever it was. Like stuff like that happened, and it's the same with Mario, where like yes, we've got like the remake of 3D World and Bowser's Fury and a few other bits along the way, and then Wonder was kind of like the return to 2D Mario, but there is still this element of like, I don't know, like we waited we've been waiting a lot longer for an Odyssey follow up than we waited for a Breath of the Wild follow up at this stage, which feels weird to say, but it's true, and that's before something's even been revealed, let alone released, which Tears of the Kingdom now has. I'd love it to be an Odyssey 2. They've obviously done that in the past with Galaxy and Galaxy 2, the difference of that in case being that they were both released on the same console, which these two might not, unless the Switch successor is kind of considered a weird extension of the Switch somehow by Nintendo. You just don't know how they're going to do it. Like if it is a Super Switch or a something like that, then maybe you do get an Odyssey 2 because they consider it part of the same family. I don't know. I do have one question for you though, Jonesy, and it's an uncomfortable one, but it's going to be more uncomfortable when the time comes. As a man who shares his home with a family of avid gamers and feels pressures and responsibilities to deliver in certain areas, regardless of how realistic said deliveries might be, you have a PlayStation 5 Pro that releases in November of 2024 and a Switch that releases in March of 2025, just a handful of months between them. What does the Alex Jones household get first?
If I'm looking at amount played, I think the PlayStation 5 Pro is for me would be the thing. But the funny thing is, they wouldn't notice a difference because when it comes to the sort of games that my kids play, and that they're going to be, it's more like they like new games and they like to sort of be able to play new games, but they're not going to be looking at high resolutions, etc. for a Switch 2 or anything the PlayStation 5 Pro is going to offer. So I could probably get away with getting either, and they would be psyched. The thing that will probably move the needle for me would be games that are going to be available on the Switch 2 are probably going to be a better offering and more enticing than potential games that are going to be offered on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Because as we've said, there's nothing really coming out when they've said this is coming out, and even the games that they are sort of saying, the games that they are touting coming out are not ones that my kids will be playing anyway. Like sort of Wolverine, etc. So it's okay. A long-winded way of saying Switch 2, I guess, would be the Switch.
The little ones aren't going to be playing. The little ones aren't going to be playing GTA 6.
They will not be playing GTA 6.
Here's a weird thought for you though. The idea of your kids playing GTA 6 probably horrifies you. But if GTA games continue to have the same life cycles, are around as long as they are, and as popular as long as they are, and have the same cultural impact as they have had in the past, then GTA 6 will be your kid's first GTA.
It won't. The second, because if you say that my eldest will be, well, it depends when I let them play certain games. My oldest will be, he'll be 18 in 11 years. So
if GTA 6 makes it out in 2025, then it will have been 12 years since GTA 5.
Oh, wow, okay. But then that's weird, because then would he play, if I had made him wait till he was 18, would he wait 8 years to play GTA 6? I think maybe he wouldn't be bothered by that. So maybe
again,
GTA
that's
be his first.
That's like six years. Would a teenager have played GTA 5 for the first time in 2019? I think absolutely.
Yeah, maybe.
And of course, a lot of this depends on things like, does it have the same longevity? Does it get ported forward to as many consoles, which in the case of GTA 5 was released on the PS3 and 360, and then re-released on the PS4 and Xbox One, and then patched for the PS5 and Series X, while also being on PC, and while also producing one of the most significant and popular online multiplayer sort of services of all time. I don't know if GTA 6 will do all of that, so maybe I'm wrong, but it's a possibility.
Mate, these are all moot points anyway, because they will be playing Roblox until they are old and grey on iPads if they continue the way they're going, which is horrendous. The quality of the utter garbage and crap that they play on Roblox is maybe. I saw them doing it earlier today. Because I looked at my PS5 friends list and I was like, oh, Josie's playing Roblox again. I was playing it. But they played. So this is the thing, they play together. So one of them plays on the iPad and one of them plays on the PlayStation. Ironically, the 5-year-old plays on the PlayStation 5 and the 7-year-old plays on the iPad, because that's the way they like doing it.
Interesting.
But maybe I should be more supportive of Roblox, because that's grassroots gaming. That's people developing games at home. That's microtransactions into games that kids play to make some spare Robux. So
it's definitely not youth being exploited into labor.
Definitely not.
No, of course, it's all healthy. It's all above board, and there are definitely no long-winded documentaries about everything the Roblox Corporation is doing wrong, laid out in excruciating detail. But yeah, no, it will be interesting to see what the future holds for Roblox, for GTA, and for your children. I wish all of them all the best and all the health in the world. Before we go, Jonesy, one last thing I wanted to quickly touch on, as something that is, depending on how your newsfeed is created, something that you'll have been reading a lot about in the past couple of weeks, but also something that Jonesy, both you and I have been playing, and in my ignorance, I forgot to ask you about in the designated "what have you been playing this past week" section of the show, which I just completely skimped over. Unfortunately, though, I know the answer to the question, and I'm pretty sure it starts with an H and ends in a 2.
It does. The only thing I have been playing is Helldivers 2, and with you as well, and like we said earlier, with some people in the Discord, and also with public matchmaking, and it's what a fantastic game and fantastic time to be a gamer and be able to hop in and play. Well, sometimes be able to hop in and play some Helldivers 2 if the servers aren't exploding at the seams.
Which they have been every night now, I think, since Friday night, pretty much.
Yes, yeah, they've been difficult, to put it mildly. No, I'm sure that game will wane, and I'm sure that it will be something that people kind of go, oh, do you know what? I think I've reached the end of this. I've got as much out of it as I'm going to get. But at the moment, I'm still thoroughly enjoying it. And the big part of that is if you look at the Twitter threads, if you look at the little videos people are making, if you look at some of those like fun little things that can happen to you in that game, I think that is in no small part is its success. And I think playing with other people, like playing with you and the guys on the Discord and patrons and things, it's that game that just gets ratcheted up to another level. Like when you're laughing your head off and you're going like, they're everywhere, help me out, and you're sort of like, it really does. It really does get elevated to the sort of game that I think we all like hope to play. And when you, in the sense of whenever we see a new game get dropped and then they do that thing where they sit on stage and they're team together like they did back in the day with the Division, and they're like, contact, 2 left, and then you get the reality of what it's actually like to play that game, and you've got some 14-year-old twat going, oh, you knobhead, what are you doing? But Helldivers really has got some, because the interactions aren't supposed to be sensible. They're not supposed to be marine style. They're supposed to be over the top. Like the bloody characters themselves laugh maniacally when they're unleashing, clip after clip on bugs and automatons. So I think they hit the tone beautifully. I'm loving it. I'm not very good. I do a lot of friendly fire by accident, but I'm working on it.
You're doing your part. Like that's all people can ask of you.
I'm doing my part for democracy, Jamie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
No, it's been really encouraging to see, and obviously, like between the volume of concurrent users and some of the sort of the lofty heights those have hit, and the degree to which they're having to increase their server capacity, I'm sure that's both a headache and a blessing at the same time. I thought it was interesting that concurrent players hit such a high in this past week that it was the highest of any title that was, I think, published by PlayStation or Xbox, so overtaking Destiny 2 and Starfield, respectively. And in doing so, kind of becomes, along with Power World, I suppose, which was a different kind of success. Power World was, it blew up, it was everywhere, it was the biggest game on the planet for a weekend, and then the trail off began. Helldivers has had a kind of, it won't peak at the same point as Power World, that's for sure. Well, at least it seems pretty sure, but it's had a slower on-ramp, that's for sure. And perhaps a slightly more sustained sort of like middle period of success as a result. But there must be a lot of companies out there of different shapes and sizes taking a good degree of encouragement that quote unquote viral successes and games that are born out of strong word of mouth for adhering to pretty simple values like, hey, make the game fun, are just as viable in 2024 as they have been ever, if not more so. Like, price the game right, make it fun, helps if you let people play it with their friends, and like, word will spread.
Yes, and I think it just points to the fact of if you just nail, certain things. Well, not even nail them, but if you just like put love into game and put it into games and really believe.
Yeah.
I think really believe in a game that you're making, then then it can hit and it can do really well for you. It made me think of the fact I'd seen in the week. Someone had mentioned that in stark contrast to Helldivers 2 and how well that's sort of performing, and as to juxtapose it, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League on Steam, I think, is at the moment struggling to maintain like 1,000 players, which is like baffling when you consider a company like Rocksteady and the size they've been, and Helldivers, and then you look at those two games and you say like, well, Suicide Squad's only been out for a few weeks, and I'm assuming the Helldivers isn't going to take a nosedive in the next couple of weeks, but the fact that you can have a £30 game do as well as it's doing with so many people playing it, and you could take a game like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, which is now probably doing worse than Marvel's Avengers was doing at the same point in its life cycle, like almost definitely doing worse.
Yeah,
is shocking.
Yeah, it's been really kind of like quite stark seeing the two release relatively close to one another, and so being able to kind of compare the two quite directly in terms of how they launched, the word of mouth, the kind of the positivity and the feelings around them, the sentiment, and then the kind of the tales that they've had. The case of Suicide Squad, like, it's really not hard for me as someone who has finished that game to believe that it's experiencing what it's experiencing. The fact that we're sat here on the 20th of February at the time of recording, and I still don't know for sure when season 1 of Suicide Squad is arriving beyond, I think, at some point in March, is baffling to me, especially when I merge that with my thoughts and experiences with just how limited the Suicide Squad's endgame is. Like, the most damning thing I could say about Suicide Squad is that, as I hinted at in a recent episode of the podcast, I was still having fun when I rolled credits on the Suicide Squad, and immediately ran out of reasons to play.
Right.
Like the fact that they lost someone like me who could have actually been, I'd have kept it quiet. Don't get me wrong, I'm not out here for getting crucified online. But like the fact that a theoretical Suicide Squad fan got lost in the result of how they've handled sort of like the end game and the gap between launch and actual seasonal content or any content at all. And then also I thought they really botched their first update, considering how many things are still, broken or wrong or underwhelming about that game. And they pushed out this initial update that was targeting, overpowered builds and things like that. And it's like, guys, there are bigger fish to fry than there are people who are using a certain build that's allowing them to do too much damage in your already repetitive endgame content. Like, really, that's the top thing you're addressing. Like, and I get it, it's a live service game, and there are probably all kinds of statistics and information that they've got that suggests that an overpowered build means that people complete things too quickly, which means they get loot too quickly, which means they get satisfied too quickly, which means they stop playing too quickly. And we live in such a fucking occasionally dystopian feeling time for video games that an overpowered build is probably the worst thing for player retention on planet Earth. And so maybe that's why it becomes the top priority from the perspective of people who are just trying to fucking have fun. It looks fucking like a shitty fucking move. And when Helldivers is out here, like, and it's going through way more launch problems and queues and like fucking server-side issues than Suicide Squad ever had. Actually, that maybe not necessarily ever had. Suicide Squad did launch with a bug that let players complete the game by launching it. So,
yeah.
so
on entering,
it's like caveat. But yeah, like basically what I'm saying is that like it's quite stark when you lay the two out side by side and see what went right, what went wrong, and this kind of reoccurring theme that we see a lot. That is actually the name of the blog post that the last time I visited Arrowhead's website is at the top of the homepage, which is that a game for everyone is a game for no one. And the more you simplify and homogenize your game and try and make a product that appeals to as many different people as possible with colored and tiered loot and endless skill trees and all the kind of mod cons that people have convinced themselves they want, when actually like people just want to drop a bomb on aliens and kill one of their friends in the process.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think, and it's the other thing with Held. I mean, I'm sure part of it as well is that when you have a game which should be really good, like Suicide Squad should have been really good. It had all the reasons to be good, and then it seems to have just failed. And then Helldivers came out of nowhere, not nowhere, but like came out of relatively a smaller area, and people weren't thinking it was going to be the next massive thing. And then when you play it and go, oh damn, this is actually fantastic, like that does a lot. And getting it out there and people showing videos of being like, wow, this game's actually fantastic, and getting people to jump in and play it in that way, rather than people playing something they thought was going to be good and being let down. I'm sure that does a lot of the heavy lifting. But no, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. To make a game which tries to appeal to everyone, you're gonna, like, if you say, oh, we can't have people enjoying killing bugs too much because some people might not like that, so we're not going to have your character laugh like a crazy person when they like empty a full machine gun clip into, like, no, do it. And then you got guys that screaming, my leg, and then just like whatever. All that stuff's fantastic. And I feel vindicated as well, because when I saw the trailers back in like quite a while ago, I was like, oh my goodness, that's Starship Troopers the game, but a good version. Like I want to play that.
Ouch.
I'm being too mean. I don't mean to be too mean about it.
No, that game needs content. Don't worry, you're allowed to be mean to the Starship Troopers game.
But for the fact that now that all the Starship Trooper memes I see, I'm just like, I was one of the people that they were making this game for, and I fully am on board with it. Like dumping a clip of a machine gun into a bug that is bearing down on you and doesn't die until it's half a foot in front of you is so satisfying. Like I could do it all day.
Yep. They got the fundamentals absolutely bang on, so more power to them. And yeah, I hope Helldivers 2 goes on to become like a bit of a, I don't know, a positive beacon, of positive energy, and a reminder of what a huge amount of people out there playing and buying games want from the software at this point in time. So yeah, nice in some respects to end what I think is a net positive note. Like, I know we slagged off a couple of games that got caught in the undertow there. Apologies to Suicide Squad. A lot of really talented and hardworking people.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time making that game what it is, and it has some extremely strong attributes and deserves to be more, in some regards, deserves to be more celebrated than it is.
I look forward to playing it when it goes on sale.
Maybe wait till it's free. But yeah, that's video games, I guess. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of the Super Show podcast. Again, a cheeky shout out, and I guess almost an apology as well to the folks that caught the one-off first 10 minutes of this podcast in a live format before I cut things short and had a little cry, and Jonesy got me to puke and rally, and we recorded this offline version that is pouring into your eyes and ears as we speak. Thank you all so much for sticking with us and for enjoying, hopefully, this episode of the podcast. Thank you, Jonesy, for being such a wonderful Sherpa up the mountain of video games once again. I love you.
Thank you, mate, for being such a fantastic host, as always, and doing all of the work on the back end for pulling all the information together. I think I don't give you enough credit for every week in, week out doing that, and people probably don't realise how much effort you put in behind the scenes.
What?
So thank you, mate.
It's not effort or work when you love video games. We love them. Hopefully you love them too. And if you do truly love video games, then you'll do me a favour and keep your eyes and ears tuned to the YouTube channel this time next week for what will hopefully be the release of a very special and very fun and nostalgia-fueled episode 200. Look forward to it, and we will see you there. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
See ya.